Namaste and welcome to Pods by PEI, a policy discussion series brought to you by Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. My name is Khushi Rai. In today's episode, we have PEI colleague Nirjan Rai in conversation with Aditya Valliathan Pillai on how to handle the heat lessons from India. Nirjan and Aditya discuss the rising temperature in Nepal, India, and around the world. The two talk about the science behind heat waves and how climate change exacerbates the problems. They also discuss the economic impacts and how they are unevenly distributed across society. Using Aditya's recent publication that analyzes India's heat action plans, the two look for possible takeaways for Nepal in dealing with its rising incidences of heat waves. Aditya is a fellow with the Initiative for Climate, Energy and Environment at the Center for Policy Research, where he studies the socio-economic consequences of climate impacts in India and South Asia and the policies and institutions that help adapt to these changes. His current works focus on strengthening policies to combat extreme heat. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Hi, this is Nirjan Rai.
And hi, this is Aditya Valliathan Pillai.
Hey Aditya, welcome to Pods by PI. So before we begin, let me just put out a brief context of our conversation today. As I was preparing for this discussion, I was going through some of the official data published for Nepal and just saw that the April temperatures in the Terai region have consistently crossed the 40 plus degree mark. But this pattern of record high temperatures is not confined to just the Terai region. It's also happening in places like Kathmandu, which is known for having much milder weather conditions. As a result, we are witnessing a rising trend of school closures extending to hilly regions such as Gorkha and Tanahun. To my surprise, I even came across some news reports that Nepal is experiencing record heat extending as far north as Lukla. And it's only now that we're beginning to understand, or at least trying to understand, what sort of impact this will potentially have in our economy and our society as a whole. And that, Aditya, is what I hope to discuss with you today. So to begin, can you tell us about the heat situation in India? I've actually never lived in Delhi, but I know a family and friends who have, and almost everyone speaks of how hot things get there, especially during the summer. So what is it like there at the moment?
Simply put, it's very, very hot. The temperature is frequently 45 plus in the middle of the day out in the sunshine. And I've been carrying a thermometer around trying to measure the temperature of different surfaces. And for example, if you're on a motorcycle in direct sunlight in the afternoon, the temperature gauge can go up to 47, 48 degrees, right? The situation this summer has been an interesting one. Firstly, the summer started very early. So we saw these heat wave alerts as early as February, and it was the hottest February on record. And then we saw heat deaths at the end of March, early April, I want to say, in Maharashtra. So we saw 13 people die at this large public rally. And that created a bit of a media storm, and there was an entire political blame game that played out after that. And that was a bit of an important moment, and I think it'll go down as a moment of reckoning about what heat can do, especially if it's not handled correctly. And then we've seen sporadic heat wave alerts all across the country in places that you would expect, like in the desert areas of Rajasthan or northern Gujarat, and then in places that haven't traditionally been at the epicenter of Indian heat. So along the Konkan coast, along the Arabian Sea, for example, we saw heat wave alerts in Karnataka and Maharashtra, and that's also where we saw these deaths in Maharashtra. And then we've seen heat wave alerts pop up in all sorts of interesting, hitherto unexpected places. So for example, in Meghalaya, which is a mountain state in the northeast, in the lush forested northeast, we saw schools close, as you were mentioning earlier, because of these heat wave alerts. And one of the things I want to point out, which is different from Nepal's understanding of heat, is India has this incredibly long coastline, 7,000 kilometers, and the sea makes it very humid. And because we're closer to the equator, it's very hot. So when you mix heat and humidity, you get a sometimes lethal cocktail because the body can't cool down when it's very humid. The sweat doesn't evaporate off the body. And that's only after a certain threshold temperature. And so we saw that threshold temperature this wet bulb temperature reached a couple of times in some parts of eastern India this year. So that was also a big warning because that's what everyone's worried about when it comes to heat fatalities. It's this wet bulb threshold being crossed. So it's been an important summer from a learning perspective.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, despite having all these different environments, it seems like it is spread throughout the country, all over India. Wow. So moving on, in May, you wrote an op-ed piece stating, and I quote, India's recent heat deaths are not outliers. They signal a dismal future unless we start taking the threat of heat seriously. Now, can you give us a background on this piece and perhaps explain why the heat this time around is different from the heat of the past?
I'm glad you bring that up. So that op-ed was written in response to the deaths that I just talked about, 13 people dying in the state of Maharashtra after a public rally, and they were sort of exposed to heat from 9 a.m. in the morning to afternoon. And the sort of continuous heat exposure, and some suggested this was over many days, led to the unnecessary loss of life. And most of them were allegedly women. Some reports suggest that 9 of the 13 that died were women. So it was also this case study of how the most vulnerable in society are the ones that are going to be most affected by things like heat and other climate impacts. And then a few weeks later, there was this, again, very tragic incident of a tribal woman who was 9 months pregnant. She was trying to get to her local primary healthcare center, but died of a heat stroke. She was walking many kilometers and supposedly walked 7 or 8 kilometers in the heat and then died of heat stroke. The baby was lost as well. And my colleague Sachit Balsari, who's an ER doctor at Harvard and thinks about heat and climate impacts, and we were sort of thinking what lessons we could take away from this. And one of the points that Sachit wanted to make was that this is very different from the heat of our childhoods, mainly because the heat of our childhoods was at most an inconvenience, right? So you'd have a rash or you'd sweat too often and your clothes would get damp or you feel a bit tired and you weren't able to play as much as you normally might have in very hot parts of India. But now we've reached a point where exposure to that sort of heat in certain parts of the country, certain extreme parts of the country, can lead to serious illness. And in some even more extreme cases, if it's prolonged exposure, can result in death. So it's a public policy problem, it's a public health problem, and lessons need to be learned. And the lessons need to be learned now before anything really, really, really bad happens, which is, there's great potential in this country to have heat deaths that number in the hundreds or in the thousands. And that's something that's happened before and something that cannot happen again. And so these moments when, the lessons from this summer, for example, reveal so many things that we can fix and get right. And I'm sort of reminded of something you said a long time ago, which is in governance and in public policy, there are only lessons learned. And so that's really the objective, actually, of this op-ed. It was just trying to start this conversation about what can we tweak and what can we fix, what screws can we tighten, what parts should we get rid of, that sort of thing.
That's quite a depiction of the heat-related issues and some of the ideas we can learn from. By the way, Aditya, before we go any further, can you quickly define heat wave? I know you mentioned that and some of it could be technical, just so that all of us are aware of the term.
Sure. It's an important question. It's actually not the most straightforward thing to answer, but very simply put, a heat wave is multiple days of extreme heat to a point where it crosses the adaptive capacity of that community, and you start seeing detrimental effects on the public health system, on economic productivity, and so on. So normally the way a heat wave works is you have a declaration of a heat wave when a certain threshold temperature is passed. And that threshold temperature is usually defined by some sort of historical understanding of the temperature at which more people start dying or economic productivity starts falling. And so if that threshold exists for a couple of days, then that's a heat wave. And then immediately what's supposed to happen is you're supposed to have all these response actions that kick into gear, right? So making sure that all rehydration solution is available, or making sure your local healthcare center has enough cooling, so enough ice, or has an air conditioner running, the electricity system stays stable, and so on and so forth. So that's why the declaration of a heat wave is important. And the declaration of a heat wave is based on some understanding of when heat gets dangerous. You wouldn't call every hot day a heat wave day. There's a scientifically determined threshold that has to be followed.
And who declares? Is it the government because it seems there are some institutional responses?
So it varies. Across the world, it varies. The threshold is usually determined in the local heat action plan. So the way it works is you'd ideally have some sort of local data that tells you that this is the temperature, right? So 39.7 is the temperature at which we start seeing hundreds of more deaths. And so at 39.6, 39.5, 39, we should have a heat wave declaration. And it depends on who's in charge, right? In many countries, it's the local government that declares a heat wave in a particular area based on their local temperature readings. In India, the Indian Meteorological Department has a national forecasting system, and it also runs thousands and thousands of temperature gauges across the country. So they detect the levels of heat and try and declare a heat wave. So it varies, but it's usually a government. Sometimes it's a national government, sometimes it's a local government, and it depends on the situation, the context, and the history of that place.
Nice. So next, let's get around to understanding the factors that have contributed to the escalation of heat waves in recent years. Now, the recent IPCC report generated quite a lot of buzz for some of its alarming conclusions about the state of our climate. Can you help us understand the science that connects climate change and the increasing frequency and intensity of heat waves around the
world? There are multiple things driving heat's emergence as a public emergency. To start with the climate side of it, it's exacerbating a problem that already existed, right? So a lot of the heat is baked into the way our cities and towns are structured. And anyone who's lived in a South Asian city or traveled through a South Asian city will know that a lot of it is concrete and glass, and that's the direction the built environment has taken recently. There's a lot of density, which means the heat is trapped even more effectively. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of tree cover, right? So you put all of that together and you have an environment that's just built to soak in all of that heat and keep it soaked in. We also have huge amounts of inequality in cities. So we'll have, high-rise air-conditioned buildings, but right next to it in many Indian cities, for example, there are large slums which have tin-roofed housing or cement roofs, flat cement roofs that really, really do keep the heat trapped in and make the situation quite unbearable, right? So there are structural problems, there's structural design issues that need to be fixed. What climate change is doing, and it's a pretty straightforward problem here, we're releasing more carbon emissions, which is trapping more heat, and that's just driving the global average temperature up. And we're about 1.1 degrees higher than the pre-industrial average, and that's in the mid-19th century. So we've gone up quite a way. The predictions are, at the current level of policy stringency, we might get to about 2.7 degrees at the end of the century. So it's going to get hotter. How much depends on how well we do in reducing carbon emissions. Because there's more heat being trapped, it means different parts of the world are warming differently. So parts of the Arctic are warming extremely, extremely fast. Europe is warming extremely fast. South Asia is already warm, but warming slower, but warming to a point where it's becoming unbearable and could be a serious threat to life. There are mountain regions across the Himalayas that are warming extremely quickly. So the rate of warming in different parts of the world is different. And then that interacts with your built environment. And you end up with some places that have this double whammy of an inhospitable built environment and extremely rapid regional rises in temperature. And that's when the heat problem becomes a really, really big problem. And so even in Nepal, right, I think, in your intro, you were talking about heat wave declarations in Terai, and Terai has consistently been hot. It also has a lot of water bodies, thousands of rivers that come down from Nepal into India. And so you could well imagine extreme heat, localized humidity conditions. And the sun is very, very strong in those parts. Anyone who's traveled to the Terai will know this. So that's where the worry really starts kicking in. And those towns are growing quite fast, right? Even the the lesser known towns of Nepal, they're growing quite quickly and are very dense.
So we can expect, given the structural issues and exacerbated by the climate change, for more hotter days to come in the future, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about, I guess, moving from that to the impacts then. And I'm okay with you discussing this in terms of what you're saying in India, as I assume these impacts would be quite similar to what is happening or will potentially happen in Nepal, right? So to begin this discussion, in a recent podcast you did with the India Energy Hour, you described heat waves as being some sort of an invisible problem, or the other word you use, death by 1,000 cuts, right? Can you expand on that? What you meant by those terms?
It's what makes heat very scary. So when you think about climate change, when you think about large-scale loss of life and property, you think about a cyclone hitting, the coast of India. You think about massive flooding in our cities. These are visible, seen, tangible effects, right? You know where it's coming, or you have a good way, a high likelihood of predicting correctly where it's going to hit. You can see the impact, you can see the damage, you know exactly who's been hit and why they've been killed or why they've lost their houses. So the insurance mechanism kicks in, the public health system kicks in. And so you build all of these protective layers over time. In South Asia, in Bangladesh, in India, and Nepal, we've all gotten much better at handling these sort of visible disasters. The problem with heat is it's completely invisible. So it doesn't hit one part of a city. It can spread out not only over a city, but an entire region, entire part of a country. And when it hits, you don't actually see the effects. So one of the great problems with heat, and this is across the world, but especially so in places where public health systems are slightly weaker, one of the big problems is when a person dies, and this is very similar to COVID, when a person dies, they're usually listed as a death due to some other proximal cause, such as, an organ failure or so on. And it's never actually attributed to heat. And they have protocols now, and, various jurisdictions are trying to figure out protocols to figure out when it's a heat death and list it as such. But the problem is most of the time we have this completely inaccurate picture of how many heat deaths there are just by looking at autopsy reports and medical records. Similarly, when it comes to the economic impacts, if you have many hundreds of thousands of people who are unable to do work on an extremely hot day, there's actually no way of picking up that they're not doing that work because of heat, right? So it just looks like absenteeism, or it looks like people haven't showed up to work. So you're left again with this sort of invisible problem of economic productivity draining out in extremely hot days, but you actually don't know exactly why that's the case when it's happening, right? So when it comes to a policy measure like instituting a labor insurance, so if a person misses a day of work, trying to make sure they're compensated adequately so that they're not forced to work in extreme heat conditions. And that's when people start dying, right? So they're working in extreme heat for 2, 3, 4, 5 days at a stretch, and they're ignoring their own alarm bells going off in their bodies. And sometimes there are hot nights, so they're not getting enough rest. If you want an insurance system to kick in, you have to be able to identify who's taking time off because of heat. And it's just something that you don't, unlike an insurance mechanism where a person's house has clearly been damaged due to a flood, this is operating at a level of intangibility and invisibility, right? But there are also other things. I mean, recently in the case of Nepal, the World Bank had this very interesting point to make in a report about how one of the big macroeconomic risks to Nepal is the fact that a lot of the workers in hot countries across West Asia, Philippines, etc., who are likely to be affected by extreme heat situations, could have their remittance outflows affected because they're just not earning as many days of the year, especially if they're tied to daily wage or they have some sort of performance benchmarked wage. And it may not be a problem now, but 30, 40, 50 years from now, when the heat really does get bad, then it's a question of also, macroeconomic stability. So that's this thing about death by 1,000 cuts. So you really can't see it. And you might ignore all of these little things, but then cumulatively, you might end up with a situation where it's a serious loss to economic productivity, right? And there are all sorts of GDP numbers thrown around. The one for South Asia, from all climate impacts, not just heat, by 2050, was that we'd lose, on average, every South Asian country would lose about 2% of its GDP. India, I remember, was about 1.8. I think Nepal was roughly in that region. So, but about 2% order of magnitude is where we'd get in terms of climate-based economic losses. I could well imagine a significant chunk of that is heat related. So it's important to keep that in mind. All of this adds up.
Yeah, definitely. And going from labor productivity, but you also have issues on effects on agriculture, consumer prices. So these all add up in many ways,
absolutely.
Right? The difficulty is in quantifying.
Yeah. We have some estimates, Nejan, though. I mean, on the quantifying side of things, on agriculture, for example, there's this ILO report that talks about how agriculture in India will be affected to the tune of 9% of all working hours lost by 2030. 9% of agricultural working hours lost by 2030. And economy-wide, that number is about 5.7, 5.8%. And in 1991, the number of the percentage of hours lost to heat, extreme heat, was 4.3. So 4.3 economy-wide, right? So we're seeing, a 1.5% increase in hours lost just in the span of about 20 years, and a huge decrease in agricultural labor productivity. And I think that story will play out in farms across South Asia, right? Definitely in Pakistan, Bangladesh. Nepal is slightly less exposed because of the structure of its agriculture production, but I think there are open questions to be asked about what happens to vegetable production, for example, especially if you have early onset heat or if you have extreme heat spikes in crucial parts of the growing cycle. So there's many things we don't know also in different economic contexts. Heat impacts differently, right? Because the system is actually quite fragile. So we'd have to think through these things.
My follow-up question was going to be around the ecological impacts and what that means for the larger ecosystem, right? I mean, there's definitely bound to be huge domino effect as a result of rising temperature. There could be impacts on the supply of water that leads to dry conditions, and then kind of favorable for forest fires, and so all of these kind of all add up. That the impacts are going to be quite huge on the entire economy, society. So it's quite out there.
Yeah, absolutely right. And it's also about the extreme cases. So what happens with glacial lake outbursts, floods in the context of extreme heat? Is there a chance that they be seen more often? Would they become more destructive? Would they become less predictable because the heat is less predictable? So these are question marks. I haven't seen any work on this stuff. But also for a country that now is seriously hinging economic prosperity to hydropower and has been very successful in building hydropower in recent years, what does the heat mean for what you were saying about how it affects the water running through a river? And then what does that mean for hydropower productivity? And if it's an extremely hot summer, one would assume that a lot of North India is really ramping up its air conditioning usage, and there's more of a balancing need, and there's more of base load need, and all sorts of things happening to the grid down in India. So there are all of these interesting interactions we haven't fully explored, but I think we'll figure out in due time.
Hi there, this is Kushi from Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. We hope you're enjoying Pods by PEI. As you know, creating this show takes a lot of time and resources, and we rely on the support of our community to keep things going. If you've been enjoying the show and would like to help us out, we'd really appreciate it if you could become a patron on Patreon. Patreon is a platform that allows listeners like you to support creators like us with a small monthly donation. Your support will go a long way in helping us to continue creating high-quality content for you. So if you're interested in supporting our show and becoming a part of our community, head on over to Patreon and become a patron today. You can find us at patreon.com/podsbypei. Every little bit helps, and we can't thank you enough for your support. Now, let's get back to the episode.
How this impact is reflected in society. You've started kind of hinting at it in your earlier responses, and we all know that impact of heat waves and other disasters in general, the impacts are clearly not distributed evenly in the society. Can you paint a picture of who is impacted the most and how in terms
Yeah,
of
this is one of the great tragedies of climate change, right? It's usually the people who have done the least in terms of their carbon emissions who get hit the worst by climate impacts. And it's no different with heat. It's that way with every disaster. It's no different with heat, right? So the first thing to think about is access to cooling and access to electricity. If you want to buy an air conditioner, that's out of reach for most of South Asia, over 90% of South Asia at the moment. And access to stable, high quality electricity is out of reach to a significant chunk. And especially when it becomes extremely hot and the grid is overloaded, there isn't enough thermal productivity or hydro productivity to keep the grid running. I don't know how it works exactly on Nepal's grid, but last year in India we had unseasonal heat in March, and there was this scramble to make sure thermal power productivity was high enough to meet the demand of the early heat. So they were scrambling rail rakes filled with coal from various coal mines across the country and rushing them to thermal plants to make sure that cooling could be accessed. And so most people don't actually have regular, reliable access, especially in these extremely hot conditions. The second part of this is once you probe a little bit deeper into the structure of our cities, it's usually the people who have the least ability to cope with this in terms of monetary padding, in terms of a monetary buffer, right? So the problem is if you're an agricultural worker who's come in from a small town and just moved to a large bustling town in the Terai, or similarly in any place in UP or Bihar, or as I see around me in Delhi, you're usually going to come into a sort of neighborhood where you don't have a lot of space. You potentially don't have access to the best cooling. And you're also working a job that is extremely heat exposed. So most of this is informal service work in extremely hot, cramped environment. Some of it might be informal manufacturing work. Like I was mentioning earlier, a lot of people are employed in the gig economy, so they have delivery guys riding around motorcycles all day. People might end up setting up roadside stalls, which are directly heat exposed. And these are people that can't afford to take a day off, which comes back to that point earlier about labor protection and insurance mechanisms to make sure that days off are compensated. So what one does is you keep going. It's a hot day, you're tired, you haven't had a lot of rest, you keep going because you can't take the day off, and you're living essentially it's a hand to mouth existence. And those are the people that end up the worst off, right? And then you step back to a macro level away from the city and you think about inequity in a country at large. Urban areas are much richer than rural areas, generally, almost as a rule. But then the agricultural impacts of heat are so huge that it has this effect of making already vulnerable farming communities, and not just the farming community, but also the non-farm work in a village extremely vulnerable to heat impacts at the economic level, right? So you could well end up in a situation where wheat productivity is completely wiped out. So last year in India, we lost about 5% of wheat productivity, and they had to put in place an export ban. And that has huge impacts on how these communities are structured and able to function, right? There were some districts in India where the loss of wheat productivity was about 30%. Loss in green gram was about 40%. So we're seeing massive losses. And so what happens to the next cropping season, right? And so again, it's farm labor, it's small scale farmers, they're also affected by this. So if you stitch all of this together, right, all the stuff I've told you about, so 2% GDP loss, construction workers and gig workers, and all these people trying to make a living in the cities, and farmers who are already precarious and vulnerable and are sort of at the edge of their economic sustainability, like staring down the precipice, all of them are affected by heat. And then you stitch together this macro story of what South Asia is going to look like in the next 20, 30 years. And that's very worrying because it looks like it's going to really seed greater inequality in our societies. Because you and I have the ability to cool ourselves, and our productivity isn't really going to fall. And that's going to be true of most people who are doing white collar jobs in cities across. And that's a huge chunk of the population, right? It's many hundreds of millions of people in South Asia. But the problem really becomes that we're going to be doing our jobs 20, 30, 40 years from now from the comfort of our air conditioned rooms, just as society outside becomes more starkly unequal and potentially more unstable. So heat is just one part of that, but it's probably going to be a pretty big part of it, given how much of an effect it has on economic productivity.
So let's move on to how we deal with the heat, right? So we've talked about these causes and impacts now. Can you start by the overall approach? Like, how should we be looking at the issue of heat in order to tackle this as a problem?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we did this study recently, and we tried to figure out what India's heat action plans look like. And maybe I can tell you and our listeners what the standard heat action plan is. So the standard heat action plan is a document that focuses very largely on information dissemination. So we now are at a point with our meteorological sciences to be able to predict a heat wave a couple of days in advance, which gives people a little bit of time to respond, gives the public machinery time to prepare. So that part of it is quite important, and they build out the information dissemination mechanism, right? So the heat wave alert will go from the Met department to X government department to X local government department to all of these different NGOs. And so they have a structure through which they embed this information in society. Heat action plans also try to think about what the immediate emergency response measures in a heat wave, in a declared heat wave are, right? And so this is mainly about preventing the loss of life. So they do things like reduce the number of working hours or make sure that people aren't working when it's really hot out. They try and make sure that schools aren't open in extremely hot times. Weddings will be conducted at night. Tourism places will be closed. Tourist attractions will be closed during a heat wave. And of course, the healthcare system is massively beefed up, right? So they make sure that there's enough resources to handle heat stroke and heat stress cases. And so that's the response. What heat action plans of late have been doing is they've also been thinking about preparedness measures, right? So this is actually changing your the morphology of your towns and your cities, which is thinking about how do we make these places cooler? Can we have urban shades? So can we have trees in certain parts? Can we have water troughs or small lakes or restore lakes to make sure that there's a little bit more cooling in that local area? And this is, as long as humid heat is not a problem. Can we have building codes that make sure that we're not trapping all this heat by having glass fronted buildings, which has become this trend in South Asian small town architecture? So it's a very expansive plan, clearly. It'll involve multiple departments. It involves a lot of coordination and requires investment. But this is what the general governmental response looks like by and large. And this is true across the world, actually. It's not just in India. It's a bit of public health. It's a bit of information dissemination, early warning. It's a bit of changing your built structures. So it's all quite complex.
You touched on urban planning, and this is something I wanted to kind of visit here. Now, since most of us live in urban areas and the urban population is expected to grow exponentially, do you have any thoughts on the role of urban planning? I mean, how it's to be done? It seems like a very long-term solution, but what is the approach that governments should be taking on this?
Yeah, I'm always struck by this example of what they did in LA. So the mayor in LA, Eric Garcetti, he set up this very interesting target of trying to cool LA by 3 degrees, which at first sounds a little odd because, we're talking about a Paris Agreement that's trying to limit global warming to 1.5 and well below 2 degrees. And so here we have a city that's talking about 3 degrees, and that's interesting. And the whole solution mechanism there to try and get to that 3 degree target is to try and make sure you get every little bit of cooling you can out of how you structure your city, right? So if you have surfaces that are concentrating and absorbing heat, you get rid of them. So if you have glass faces, they get glass face buildings that get a lot of sunlight exposure and are reflecting that sunlight onto the street surface, and you do something to make sure that they aren't reflecting as much sunlight onto the street. You change the paving of the streets, you start introducing trees along the pavements, you build shade structures, kind of like giant bus stops, for example. And each of these things will have, very different levels of viability in different cities, right? I mean, I can fully imagine that it's hard to grow a lot of trees in some Indian cities where the density is really high and houses are right there up against the road because you can't have the roots dig into people's foundations. These are ultra long-term solutions. Now, for a lot of South Asian cities, the building stock is only coming up now. And, some say that, as much as half or maybe even more of India's building stock by the mid-century is yet to have been built. So that's a huge opportunity, right? So that's something we can try and build heat resilience into right away at a very low cost rather than having to retrofit cities. And I think the problem is when you have to retrofit huge cities of tens of millions of people, it's a very expensive proposition. Then the question becomes about financing. The low cost way of doing resilience is thankfully in a lot of developing countries, we haven't built it yet. You have to have the state capacity and the foresight to be able to build in regulation right at the outset to make sure that these buildings and the zoning and so on is such that it's not extremely hot, right? So if you want to encourage green roofs and roof gardens or cool roofs, which is the white painting, and make sure that the structures isn't a lot of density around a large building or some green space somewhere. That's something that we need to get on now because those buildings are going to come up in the next few years and they're going to exist for the next couple of decades. And so if a building comes up in 2025 and exists to 2065, the temperature is going to be much higher in 2065. So these buildings, ironically, aren't going to be living out the rest of their lives in the conditions they started. But the engineers and the architects are constantly plotting for current conditions and not future conditions. So these are the things that we really need to fix when it comes to the urban environment.
Excellent point. I wanted to get into, you already mentioned your study on the heat action plans. Now, there were some issues on findings and recommendations I wanted to touch on, which I found to be quite interesting and relevant. So one of the first points you raise is that most action plans are not built for local context and have an oversimplified view of the hazard. Can you expand on this and explain what your recommendations were to overcome the challenge?
See, it comes back to the idea that heat is just a very, very tricky policy challenge, right? And it's what we were talking about earlier, Legion, that cities are structured in such a way that there's a lot of inequality baked into the fabric of a city. So there are certain neighborhoods that end up being hotter just because of how they're structured, how they're built. And so there's just a lot more cement and the roofing is not appropriate and so on. Very, very dense places. And that's exactly where the people who have heat stressed jobs tend to work or heat exposed jobs tend to work. And this, I'm only talking about the Indian example because I think it kind of holds true, but I'm sure it's true of many places across the world. The big task then, from a policy perspective, is to be able to locate and identify exactly who those people are, right? So if you're given a map of a city and a heat wave is coming, you want to be able to target your information measures and all these urban rejuvenation measures that we just talked about, or figuring out where to change school timings and so on. You want to be targeting all of these at the places where you'll get the most value, most effectiveness in terms of reducing loss of life and making sure economic productivity doesn't fall. And so you can't be, in a city of 25 million people, you can't be targeting all 25 million people. Right? There's probably 1 million people somewhere in there that are actually the most heat exposed. And you're able to tell that if you have this mapping exercise, what they call a vulnerability assessment, of trying to figure out how much money do these people have, how much access to cooling, how much access to electricity, to water. And you put together this composite map of these different neighborhoods, and you're able to tell, okay, so this is where the heat is the most based on your weather data and like historical heating patterns in a city, and this is where the people are most vulnerable and least able to deal with the heat. And so you put those two bits of data together, and that's where you need to be focusing all your public interventions around heat, right? When you don't have that, the problem is you're flying blind because it's a city of 25 million people. How do you know where to direct the radio jingles and where to direct the teacher trainings and training teachers on heat, that is, where to beef up the public health capacity? So it's one of those problems. And again, that's why it's important to recognize that this is different from other disasters in the sense that one doesn't have the ability to see it. So you don't actually know where it's going to hit you the worst. And so you have to have a sort of predictive capability, and that's where the localization is important, understanding where exactly the most vulnerable people are.
So the other issue that I thought was interesting was that there's funding-related issues, right? There's a difficulty of getting funds. The other related point is this is not mandated by law. How do you get the politics right so that policymakers actually attend to this particular problem?
That's a very tough question. Let me put it this way, right? I'm generally pessimistic about this, and maybe I'll just be upfront about my pessimism, which is the problem with adaptation in this universal climate policy. The problem with adaptation is it's not suited to political incentive structures, because you're talking about precautionary actions which require fairly high levels of upfront investment. Unfortunately, in a case like heat, there is no large, tangible, visible structural object that you're creating, right? It's about increasing capacities in hundreds of departments and thousands of people and creating early warning systems. None of this can be seen. Unlike a dam or a seawall, and these are, quintessential climate adaptation infrastructure investments. You don't have that. And so you're basically asking the political class to make large investments into preventing a problem that is generally unpredictable. You have a lot of people saying that this is a problem. You can't really see the deaths because the deaths are popping up in all sorts of weird ways as multi-organ failure and so on and so forth. And really, the worst of this is only going to come 10 years from now, 15 years from now. It's like 3, 4 election cycles down the line. And that's just a problem that's baked into climate adaptation. So one way of thinking about it is if there's enough popular understanding of heat being a problem, climate being a problem more generally, then there is potential to get it right. The funding and so on follows from this, right? If there's enough recognition in the system that this is a problem and that solving it can do many good things. So it's not just that you'll reduce heat resilience. If you have more livable cities, like the stuff that we were talking about, having trees in places so you have more shade, that creates a more livable city, right? Having less cement and making it easier for people to walk around even at midday makes for a more livable city. And similarly, improving the quality of life of the most poor people in your community improves the general standard and quality of living across the city. So there's so many co-benefits to heat action. If there is some understanding of this, and this is, I know it's this improbable thing of saying, may wisdom prevail and then everything will be fine. But if wisdom does prevail, it would be great. I'm just, the political part of that I only think can come through greater awareness. The other side of it, and this is the more depressing side of it, is that it'll come through large scale heat death events. And that's historically been the case. So we've seen that with the Chicago 94 heat waves. We've seen that with a whole bunch of European heat waves, Paris 2003, and many thereafter, where the public machinery springs into life and plans are created and so on after the fact. And maybe the only way this works and we get more heat resilient is if we learn our lessons, right? Even in India, we have many dozens of heat action plans now, but it only started after the loss of, I think, something like 800 people in Ahmedabad, in Gujarat, in 2010, I think it was. And that was the benchmark. And then we saw this massive public policy diffusion story of heat action plans in different states, in districts and cities, and so on. So that's the darker side of how people end up responding to this. But yeah, funding is a huge problem. I think as a result of this, funding is a massive problem. This is true of climate plans across India, and I suspect it's true of climate plans across the developing world, where there just isn't enough money for these new instruments of public policy. So India's climate action plans in general, the National Action Plan on Climate Change, State Action Plan on Climate Change, the heat action plans, the district disaster management plans, all of these things don't come with tight baskets of funding. There's some funding pools available, there's some pots of funding, but it's an open question as to how a line department in a state government, and I think this is relevant, especially in the context of federalism in Nepal, it's an open question as to how local governments and what we call state governments here, provincial governments, that don't have a lot of capacity and access to finances are able to implement all of this climate planning, which comes with no special funding. So this is just a general problem. And I'm not sure how much we can rely on the private sector for adaptation financing. I'm sure in some cases, for some interventions, it's possible. So for example, with the air conditioners, I could kind of assume that there'd be some scale effects that let it happen. But otherwise, it is a big problem.
So based on your research and your experiences of having worked and traveled in South Asia, do you think there are any takeaways, good or bad, that countries like Nepal can take from India's experience with dealing with the heat?
Yeah, I think one big lesson is the default way of dealing with heat is greater air conditioning. And that is something, as far as I know, it's about 8.5% of India's population has air conditioning at the moment. And that creates problems in terms of managing the grid, in terms of creating maladaptive risks, because you're creating more emissions to solve the heat and therefore creating more heat, which then will lead to more emissions. And that's just sort of an endless cycle. And it's also not possible politically or perhaps even ethically to ask people not to have cooling, especially when it's so hot and we're talking about this being lethal levels of heat. So that's one thing to think about. That's the default direction. Then how do we make sure that cooling is something that doesn't blow the emissions budget and doesn't make the problem worse for people? Is it energy efficient cooling? Is it having different types of build structures? Is it having, sort of newer technologies like heat pumps and so on, community level cooling with some centralized cooling repository? I don't really know what the solutions are, but that's an ongoing discussion here, and I don't think we're very close to solving that problem. The second part of it is what I was suggesting earlier, right? In our review of these heat action plans, and in review of general climate planning in India, it's quite amazing how many co-benefits these policies can throw up, right? In terms of making life more livable, the air more breathable, in terms of making sure that we actually address inequality in a concentrated mission mode, just so that there isn't large-scale loss of life, to make sure there's more devolution of powers to local governments. Heat action plans are one instance of that, but then pretty much everything needs some degree of decentralization, localization, financing this stuff, more responsibility and authority to local governments, and most importantly, a lot more deliberative democracy, right? Because these are problems that are hyper local. And so you can't solve them without having some level of local intelligence, local input, and monitoring. So these are good things from a governance perspective, right? That's the direction you want community, society, and government to go in. And there is a lot of promise here. It isn't all doom and gloom.
As we close out our conversation today, Aditya, is there anything else you'd like to convey to our listeners? Maybe give us a few insights into some of your work that you're currently engaged in.
Yeah, so we're doing a couple of pieces of work, all sort of related to heat. We're actually very curious about some of the roadblocks to implementing these heat action plans. So it's something we've been looking at and trying to identify places where we could study the implementation bottlenecks. And I think that's important mainly to give some more color and clarity to how we could get over the financing shortfalls or how we could get around the legal enforceability problem in ways that are locally palatable and sustainable from a policy perspective. We're also thinking a little bit more about the secondary impacts of heat, right? So things like forest fires, which places like Uttarakhand and so on have so much trouble with these things. So we've been thinking about the secondary impacts of heat, because heat is this macro problem, but then the deeper you go, you end up with a whole universe of questions that need answering, right? Like I was saying about what architecture should look like in the future, how to change building bylaws, or where to plant your trees, and all of these questions aren't answered yet. So it's completely greenfield territory in that sense. It's a very exciting research area.
Excellent. And with that, we've come to the end of our episode. Thank you, Aditya, for this very insightful conversation and for graciously accepting our invitation to be part of Pods by PEI.
Great. Thank you for having me, Nirjan. It's really lovely chatting.
Thanks for listening to Pods by PEI. I hope you enjoyed Nirjan's conversation with Aditya about the rising number of heat waves around the world, including Nepal and India, the effects on the economy and society, and what we can learn from the Indian experience. Today's episode was produced by Nirjan Rai with support from Hritesh Sapkota, Sonia Jimmy, and me, Khushi Hang. The episode was edited by Nirjan Rai. Our theme music is courtesy of Rohit Shakya from Zindabad. If you liked today's episode, please subscribe to our podcast. Also, please do us a favor by sharing us on social media and leaving a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to the show. For PEI's video-related content, please search for Policy Entrepreneurs on YouTube. To catch the latest from us on Nepal's policy and politics, please follow us on Twitter at tweet2PEI. That's TWEET followed by the number 2 and PEI. And on Facebook at Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. You can also visit pei.center to learn more about us. Thanks once again from me, Khushi. We will see you soon in our next episode.